How does a unit conducting hundreds of night raids on suspected insurgents produce after-action reports so identical in language, sequence, and sometimes weapon serial number that the investigators eventually sent to review them describe the pattern not as evidence of military discipline, but as evidence of fabrication? How does the commanding officer who receives a written account of those killings, handcuffed detainees shot, pillows pressed over faces, weapons placed in dead hands, respond not by calling the military police as the law requires, but by creating a classified file labeled anecdotal, locking it in a safe, and receiving a promotion the same month? And how does the nation that demanded Russia face the International Criminal Court for War Crimes in Ukraine simultaneously promote the officer who classified that evidence to head its Royal Navy, while Australia, facing a comparable investigation into comparable conduct by its own special forces, has already charged its first soldier? Before we go further, tell me in the comments whether you believed, before today, that the British government has promoted to its highest military offices 2 men a public inquiry has named by name in connection with events it is investigating. Because what you are about to discover is not a story about rogue soldiers. It is a story about a structure. Watch until the end, because the moment that defines this story is not the deletion itself. It is what was done with the careers of the men connected to it afterward. Then let's go. To understand what happened in the fields of Helmand Province between 2010 and 2013, and what was done with the evidence of what happened there, one must first understand what Britain had built and what it had deliberately chosen not to build in the years before any of it began. The Special Air Service is the most mythologized military institution in the country. The selection process at Hereford, the motto, the black balaclava, the Iranian embassy siege broadcast live on British television in 1980. These are features of a public identity so carefully cultivated and so thoroughly absorbed into the national consciousness that they function less as information than as faith. The regiment does not confirm operations. It does not acknowledge fatalities. It does not discuss methods. It does not appear before parliamentary committees. This last fact is not a cultural preference or an administrative oversight. It is a constitutional arrangement. Unlike virtually every other NATO Special Forces unit, the United Kingdom Special Forces are not subject to parliamentary oversight. Their accountability runs in a single direction to the Prime Minister, the Defence Secretary, and the Commander of UK Special Forces. No one else is required to look. No one else is permitted to. This matters in the way the physical properties of a container matter when you are trying to understand what it holds. The conduct that would later come before the independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred inside a structure specifically designed so that the people who could stop it were the same people who would need to be told about it first, and who would bear institutional responsibility for it if they chose to pass it on. When Britain arrived in Helmand Province in force in 2006 under Operation Herrick, the regiment deploying there had spent years in high-tempo operations in Iraq. 457 British service personnel would eventually die in Afghanistan, a campaign accurately described as the bloodiest sustained British military commitment since Korea. From 2009 onwards, the primary instrument of the campaign's counterinsurgency strategy was the deliberate detention operation, a night raid conducted by helicopter against a list of names identified as Taliban commanders or bomb-making facilitators. The process by which those names were assembled and passed to special forces was described by one intelligence participant as a sausage machine. Lists were compiled, discussed briefly, and converted into kill or capture orders. The scope for misidentification was so high, the same participant said, because we didn't understand the villages and we didn't understand the tribes. What the regiment brought from Iraq was not merely experience, it was method. Witnesses told the BBC that special forces had already developed, in Iraq, the practice of planting weapons on bodies, AK-47s, specifically in their folding stock configuration, because they were compact enough to carry in a day sack and place beside a body to make a killing look legitimate. A Russian Makarov pistol, favored by Taliban leadership as a sidearm, was reportedly carried on raids because it could be photographed with a corpse to suggest the dead man had been armed with a commander's weapon. This vocabulary and the practices behind it were established inside the regiment's working culture before it reached Afghan soil. From 2009, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan would document 295 civilian deaths attributable to Special Forces night raids across 3 years. The kill count read out at NATO morning briefings was treated as a metric of success. The number of captures was not. There is one detail from this period that does not appear in most accounts of what followed, but that the record requires. In 2010, the Royal Military Police was conducting an investigation into a specific, alleged extrajudicial killing by the SAS. Investigators were due to collect a laptop computer holding data relevant to that inquiry. On the day before they arrived to collect it, UKSF headquarters staff forensically wiped the machine. The major who would later serve as senior investigating officer in the larger inquiry into the same regiment noted this in his own summary. The deletion of evidence immediately prior to recovery by the Royal Military Police was coincidental at best. At worst, he wrote, it may be deemed suspicious. That was 2010. One laptop, one investigation. One day before. The regiment also arrived in Helmand, carrying knowledge that institutional memory ran in more directions than the official record captured. In 2015, a sociologist named Samantha Krumpwutz was commissioned to examine Australian Special Forces culture following early rumors of misconduct in Afghanistan. During that work, sources with knowledge of multiple Allied Special Forces told her something she recorded and passed on. What the Australians are doing, she was told, was nothing compared to what the UK and US are doing. Australia subsequently commissioned the Brereton Report, which found credible evidence of 39 unlawful killings. It has since charged its first soldier. What comparison those words were making about British conduct is a question the inquiry now underway in London is positioned to answer. In November of 2010, one SAS squadron deployed to Helmand for a 6-month tour. Its primary assigned role was deliberate detention operations, kill or capture. The intelligence producing its target list was, by the admission of those generating it, liable to error at every stage of production. The squadron conducted more than a dozen such operations. BBC Panorama's investigation, published in 2022 after 4 years of reporting, analyzed hundreds of pages of the squadron's own operational accounts. The analysis produced not a record of varied engagements with a range of outcomes, but a record of strikingly similar reports, incident after incident, in which the sequence of events was almost identical. A compound was raided. The occupants were brought outside, searched, and restrained with cable tie handcuffs. A male was then taken back inside to assist with the search, and then, according to the squadron's own accounts, the restrained man would produce, from behind a curtain, from beneath a mattress, from some concealed location within a building his captors had already searched, a weapon. Then the man was shot. On the 29th of November 2010, a detained man was taken back into a building where he, according to the SAS account, attempted to engage the force with a grenade. On the 15th of January 2011, a detained man reached behind a mattress, pulled out a hand grenade, and attempted to throw it. On the 7th of February, a detained man attempted to engage the patrol with a rifle. The same justification was recorded for deaths on the 9th of February and the 13th of February. In at least 6 raids across the tour, the number of people killed exceeded the number of weapons recovered at the scene. The squadron's total death toll across 6 months ran into the triple figures. Not one SAS soldier sustained an injury across any of the documented incidents. A genuine firefight produces casualties on both sides. An engagement in which one side suffers triple-figure fatalities and the other suffers none is not describable as a firefight by any honest reading of the term. Ballistics experts commissioned by the BBC to examine photographs of bullet hole clusters at multiple raid sites found that the pattern of impacts, multiple rounds fired downward from above, did not appear indicative of a firefight. The same pattern appeared at 2 separate locations. The bullets came from above. The people below were not, the angle of entry suggests, standing upright and returning fire. Within the squadron's own operational reports, a further anomaly appears that requires no external expert to identify. The same weapon serial number was recorded across multiple raids conducted weeks apart against different targets in different compounds. A single weapon has 1 serial number and 1 location. A number appearing in multiple reports attributed to weapons supposedly recovered at independent scenes is not an anomaly of record keeping. It is evidence of fabrication within the records themselves. The reaction at UK Special Forces headquarters in London when the reports arrived was not silence. Senior officers read the accounts and wrote about them. An operations officer emailed a colleague to note that, by his count, it was the 10th time in 2 weeks that the squadron had sent a detained man back into a building, and he had produced a weapon. He recorded it as the 8th time a grenade had supposedly appeared. He wrote that you couldn't make it up. Another email described a specific operation as the latest massacre. A third, written by someone who had absorbed the sequence of reports and understood their institutional implication, noted that the way they were writing these up would not bear scrutiny in years to come. That sentence was written in 2011 by someone inside the organization producing the reports. The concern it expressed was not about what had been done to the Afghans. It was about whether what had been done could be kept from being seen. The reaction on the ground in Afghanistan confirmed, from a different direction, that something had passed beyond the boundaries of what the SAS own partners were prepared to witness. In February of 2011, the Afghan CF-333 Commando Unit, the Afghan Special Forces operating alongside the SAS, refused to continue. The reason, as described to investigators, was direct concern about British conduct. One CF-333 commando stated that in 2010, he had personally witnessed SAS soldiers planting drugs and guns on a man shot at a checkpoint. In one confrontation between Afghan and British Special Forces over the conduct of operations, an Afghan officer drew his pistol. Senior UK officers eventually de-escalated the incident. The Afghans did not return easily to partnership. They had decided that what they were being asked to witness exceeded whatever calculation of alliance they were prepared to make. Among the Afghans killed across the squadron's tour was the family of a man named Saifullah Gareb Yar. In the early hours of the 16th of February 2011, the sound of helicopter rotors woke the household at Kala-e-Bost, east of Lashkar Gah. Saifullah was 16 years old. In his own words later, to the BBC, his whole body was trembling from fear. Everyone was scared. All the women and children were crying and screaming. He was searched, bound, and placed with the women and children of the household. He had not been there long when he heard gunfire. When the SAS unit left, he found his father, Haji Abdul Khalik, 55 years old, shot dead. His brothers, Saddam, 23, and Atullah, 25, were found in fields near the family home. His cousin, Ahmad Shah, was found in a neighboring compound, shot through the neck. The S reported that all 4 men had been combatants who resisted the operation. An Afghan army commander present at the raid told the BBC that no one had been shooting at British forces, and that he saw this as confirmation that innocent people had been killed. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to move past. 4 members of one family were shot dead in a rural Helmand compound in the early hours of a February morning. The 16-year-old who found their bodies then spent the next decade trying to establish, through the British legal system, what his country's own government already knew. Not what it suspected, what it knew. The emails describing the operation as a massacre were sitting in Whitehall. The internal communications expressing incredulity at the accounts being filed were sitting in Whitehall. The organization that produced those communications maintained, for years in court, that no such documents existed. The distinction between what was known and what was admitted is not incidental to this story. It is the story. In March of 2011, a junior officer of the Special Boat Service sought out his commanding officer. He had recently spoken with an SAS colleague who had returned from Afghanistan, and what that colleague had described required escalation. The SAS troops in Helmand, he was told, were killing unarmed people, targeting fighting-age males aged 15 and older, regardless of whether they posed a threat. Detainees were being executed. In one case, his colleague mentioned, a pillow had been placed over a man's head before a pistol was fired. The commanding officer of the Special Boat Service at that time was a colonel named Gwyn Jenkins. Jenkins instructed the junior officer to write a formal statement recording what he had been told. The officer did so. Jenkins then wrote to his direct superior, General Jonathan Page, then head of UK Special Forces, on the subject of allegations of extrajudicial killing by UKSF. The following day, Jenkins created what is known within the British military classification system as a controlled access security compartment, a classified file whose access is limited to a defined and small number of authorized individuals. The compartment was labeled with a phrase that deserves to be read in full. It said, "Anecdotal evidence suggesting extrajudicial killings have been carried out by members of UKSF in Afghanistan." The official justification, recorded in the compartment's own paperwork, was threefold. Dissemination of the information could cause severe damage to the reputation of UK Special Forces, could prejudice further investigation, and could disrupt current operations. The Armed Forces Act of 2006 places a legal obligation on any commanding officer who becomes aware of evidence of possible war crimes to refer that evidence to the Royal Military Police. The referral did not occur. The file went into the safe. The safe was locked. Page, on receiving Jenkins's communication, commissioned a review of the squadron's tactics. He appointed a Special Forces investigating officer and sent him to Afghanistan. The officer assessed the situation and accepted the SAS version of events at face value. His final report was signed off by the commanding officer of the SAS unit, whose operations were under review. The unit reviewed itself. The review cleared it. The same month the compartment was created, April to May of 2011, Jenkins was promoted. He became head of all UK Special Forces in Afghanistan. The dossier he had labeled anecdotal remained inside the safe. Neither the Royal Military Police nor any external oversight body was told of its existence. The SAS squadron, whose conduct the whistleblower had described, continued its tour. 4 years passed before the classified compartment's existence became known to investigators. A second whistleblower, this one inside UKSF rather than in a parallel unit, eventually disclosed to Royal Military Police officers that the safe and its contents existed. By that point, a formal investigation had been opened, not the first to encounter this particular wall, and not the last. Operation Northmoor was established by the Royal Military Police in 2014. Its mandate covered hundreds of criminal allegations against UK Special Forces in Afghanistan across the period 2010 to 2013. More than 100 RMP officers were assigned to it. It operated from a secure facility. By any measure of scale and resource, it ranked among the most significant military police investigations in British history. From the beginning, it was blocked. Requests to interview UK Special Forces personnel were refused or deferred. Forensic evidence was not made available. Drone footage from the raid sites, recorded at the time of the operations and showing what had actually occurred inside the compounds, was held by UKSF. When Northmoor attempted to examine it, the footage could not be accessed on the stated grounds of equipment compatibility problems. Captain Jason Wright, the senior investigating officer, documented his frustrations in repeated internal memos, recording his objections to decisions made above his level that prevented the investigation from proceeding as a murder inquiry should. His memos went upward. The decisions they objected to did not change. Jim Pridden, a Royal Military Police warrant officer assigned to Northmoor, would later tell the public inquiry that the head of Special Forces had formally alerted Gold Command, the senior command structure overseeing the investigation, that allowing investigators to access UKSF computer data could jeopardize ongoing Special Forces operations outside Afghanistan. This was the stated justification for refusing access to the server that held operational paperwork for the squadron under investigation. The argument was, in its logic, elegant. Accessing the evidence might harm other operations. Therefore, the evidence could not be accessed. Gold Command accepted this. The data remained inaccessible. That data was held on a server that, within the investigation's internal documentation, acquired the codename Sonata. It held the operational records of UKSF Afghanistan missions, the logs, the communications, the reports that documented what operations were conducted, under what orders, with what outcomes. If the after-action reports that had alarmed headquarters in London were fabrications, Sonata was where evidence of that fabrication could be found. If the accounts filed with NATO were inconsistent with the communications of the night raids themselves, Sonata was where that inconsistency could be established. The Royal Military Police wanted it. UK Special Forces said no. Then, not yet. Then, in December of 2016, they said yes. A handover date was agreed. RMP investigators were told the data would be made available. They drove to UKSF headquarters to collect it. It was not there. Everything on the Sonata server had been permanently deleted. An unknown quantity of data had been erased. The timing was not approximate. 1 to 2 days before the Royal Military Police arrived to collect material from a server they had formally requested for more than 2 years under an explicit preservation order. As part of a murder investigation, everything was gone. Gold Command was informed of the deletion. Gold Command deferred the matter. The suggestion was recorded that the situation would be discussed in January. There is no record of that discussion having taken place. The dispute surrounding the deletion was regarded within UKSF as sufficiently sensitive to require escalation to the Director of UK Special Forces. General Sir Mark Carleton Smith held that role. He was made aware of the deletion and the circumstances of it. What was decided in his awareness of it is not established in the public record. What the record does establish is the sequence, he was told. The deletion had occurred in direct defiance of a preservation order in a murder investigation. The investigation it was meant to serve continued to be wound down rather than escalated. A senior Royal Military Police officer later captured the institution's general attitude toward the investigation's evidence requirements in 3 words: "They just ignored us." Richard Herrick, KC, representing the Afghan families at the subsequent public inquiry, placed the deletion in its legal frame. The defiance of an unequivocal direction to retain evidence, he told the inquiry, was at best highly suspicious, and at worst a patent and criminal attempt to pervert the course of justice in a multiple homicide investigation. Oliver Glasgow KC, serving as counsel to the inquiry, responded that the observation wasn't without foundation. He confirmed that the allegation before the inquiry was that the server had been forensically wiped to prevent the Royal Military Police from recovering evidence relating to extrajudicial killings. The precedent had already been set 6 years earlier in a different investigation. In 2010, UKSF headquarters staff had forensically wiped a laptop the day before RMP investigators arrived to collect it. Major Wright recorded the connection in his Northmore summary. The deletion of evidence immediately prior to recovery by the RMP, he noted, was coincidental at best. That was the laptop. This was the server. The same institution, the same pattern, the same timing, across 2 separate murder investigations 6 years apart. In 2019, Operation Northmore was formally terminated. The Ministry of Defense concluded there was no sufficient evidence to prosecute. The RMP team disputed this. Sir Jonathan Murphy, a decorated senior investigator brought in to advise Northmore, described the inquiry as flawed and ineffective and stated that military leadership had narrowed its scope to protect institutional reputation. The evidence on which the conclusion of insufficient evidence rested had been deleted 2 years before the conclusion was reached. The Ministry of Defense stated there was no sufficient evidence to prosecute. The Ministry of Defense had 2 years earlier permanently deleted the server on which the evidence would have been held. In the same period, the Overseas Operations Service Personnel and Veterans Act of 2021 was introduced by Veterans Minister Johnny Mercer. The legislation created a presumption against prosecution for alleged offenses by British service personnel overseas more than 5 years in the past. The passage of time, produced in part by successive delays, scope reductions, and evidence deletions, now functioned as a further structural barrier to accountability. Mercer himself, appearing before the public inquiry years later, acknowledged the act would be misguided if used to shelter personnel from genuine criminal accountability. He had written the act. The documents, meanwhile, had been in Whitehall all along, sitting there while Northmore ran and stalled and closed, sitting there while the legislation was passed, sitting there while Saifullah Gareb Yar, now an adult, navigated the British civil justice system to find out what had happened to his father and brothers and cousin on the night the helicopters came to Calais Bost. His lawyers, the firm Lay Day, brought proceedings in the High Court. The Ministry of Defense maintained it held no relevant documents. Under court order, in 2020, it handed over a tranche of emails and internal communications that directly contradicted this position. The documents it had said did not exist had been written by SAS officers at the time of the operations themselves. One described an operation as the latest massacre. Another expressed incredulity at what was being reported from the field. A third noted, in real time, that the accounts being filed would not bear scrutiny in years to come. A fourth recorded alarm at headquarters. Too many people were being killed on night raids, and the explanations didn't make sense. Once somebody is detained, they shouldn't end up dead. For it to happen over and over again was causing alarm. The alarm had been documented. The documents were in Whitehall. The organization had said no such documents existed. A court order proved otherwise. In July of 2022, the BBC broadcast a panorama investigation. The government denounced it within 24 hours as irresponsible journalism that jumped to unjustified conclusions. Within 24 hours of that statement, the government announced a new investigation. The thing it called a new investigation was, this time, a statutory public inquiry it could not control or close on administrative grounds. The independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan opened on the 9th of October 2023 at the Royal Courts of Justice in London. Lord Justice Charles Hatton Cave, having stepped down from his position as a Court of Appeal judge to chair it, stated in his opening remarks that the allegations before the inquiry were extremely grave. He identified 3 of them. First, that numerous extrajudicial killings had been carried out by British Special Forces in Afghanistan during the period mid-2010 to mid-2013. Second, that these had been covered up at all levels over the preceding decade. Third, that the 5-year investigation conducted by the Royal Military Police was not fit for purpose. 3 counts, from the bench on the first day. Witnesses before the inquiry were assigned alphanumeric codes. Their voices were distorted. The families of the Afghans killed in the raids were excluded from the closed hearings in which serving and former UKSF personnel gave evidence. Summaries of what those witnesses said were subsequently published on the inquiry's website, and what the summaries recorded changed the terms of the public conversation about what had happened in Helmand. A senior former UK Special Forces officer, identified in inquiry documentation as N2107, told investigators that the regiment had, in his assessment, a golden pass allowing them to get away with murder. In emails he had written at the time, he described the SAS and murder as regular bedfellows. The official accounts of operational killings were, in his words, quite incredible, a phrase understood in context to mean transparently false. One headquarters officer, reading the reports as they arrived from Helmand, wrote to a colleague in terms that contain the most precise internal self-assessment in the entire documentary record. If we don't believe this, then no one else will, and when the next WikiLeaks occurs, we will be dragged down with them. The concern was not the killings. The concern was the exposure. A junior officer, identified as N1799, had told his superiors at the time that he believed the SAS had an unofficial policy to kill all males on target, whether they posed a threat or not. Dead victims within the unit were referred to as having been flat-packed. The weapon planting practice had its own working name, Mr. Wolf, drawn from a character in a well-known film whose function is to solve problems. When the inquiry asked EO on 1799 whether those targeted would have included individuals as young as 16, he replied, "Or younger? 100%. He told the inquiry he still feared for his safety. "Breaking this code," he said, "is seen as betrayal. I feared for my safety then, and I still do now." The inquiry received, in 2024, news that altered the shape of what it was examining. Forensic investigators had partially recovered data from the Sonata server. The data had been deleted in December of 2016. It had not been completely destroyed. Some portion of what was erased in the days before the Royal Military Police arrived to collect it had been brought back. The inquiry's statement used a specific phrase. "The course of the Afghanistan inquiry has been fundamentally changed. The full contents of what was recovered have not been made public." The inquiry is expected to report in 2026. What the cover-up achieved was time. Between December of 2016 and 2024, 8 years passed during which that evidence did not exist. During those 8 years, Operation Northmoor was closed without prosecution. The Overseas Operations Act was passed. The careers of the men connected to the events under investigation moved, uninterrupted, toward the offices they now hold. To understand why those careers proceeded as they did requires understanding the structure within which they occurred. UK Special Forces are not subject to parliamentary oversight. Accountability runs to the Prime Minister and the Defense Secretary. These were the people being warned, the record shows, while the killings continued. Former Prime Minister David Cameron was repeatedly warned by Afghan President Hamid Karzai at meetings between the two leaders, witnessed by multiple attendees, that civilians were being killed in British night raids. A spokesperson for Cameron stated that any suggestion he colluded in a cover-up was total nonsense. Bruce Holder KC, a former director of service prosecutions, told the BBC he hoped the inquiry would examine the full extent of Lord Cameron's knowledge. The kill count metric driving the conduct was not an aberration within the system. It was a feature of how the system measured success. Squadrons compared their totals. The regiment had arrived from Iraq, already shaped by years of high-tempo operations in which the number of people killed was the primary evidence offered that things were going well. What the structure produced, as N2107 told the inquiry, was a golden pass, a documented, witnessed, internally communicated understanding that certain things could be done without consequence. The language of impunity, flat-packed, Mr. Wolfe, the way we are writing these up, is not the language of people who believed they might be caught. It is the vocabulary of people who believed they would not. The Australian comparison makes the British institutional response legible by contrast. The Brereton Report, published in 2020, found credible evidence of 39 unlawful killings by Australian special forces in Afghanistan. Its findings were made fully public. The Australian government established the Office of the Special Investigator to pursue criminal charges. In 2023, former soldier Oliver Schultz became the first person in his country's history to be charged with a war crime under Australian law. The first prosecution, 8 years after the conduct, a prosecution. Britain has charged no one. The 3 separate instances of evidence deletion across 3 separate investigations produced a window of years in which the evidence that might have supported charges did not exist. That window has now partially closed because the inquiry recovered some of what was erased. The investigation that should have used that evidence was closed in 2019 before the recovery occurred. The accounting that follows from all of this is not rhetorical. One SAS squadron conducted more than a dozen deliberate detention operations in Helmand Province between November of 2010 and May of 2011. 54 deaths were classified as suspicious. The squadron's total death toll across those 6 months ran into the triple figures. Not one SAS soldier was injured across the documented incidents. In at least 6 operations, deaths exceeded weapons recovered. Internal emails described specific operations as massacres, noted that the reports being filed would not bear scrutiny, and recorded that the same weapon serial number was appearing across multiple supposedly independent scenes. A junior officer formally told his commanding officer that he believed the regiment had a policy of killing all males regardless of threat. The commanding officer classified the testimony as anecdotal and locked it in a safe. He was promoted the same month. The Royal Military Police opened a murder investigation. Witness access was refused. Forensic evidence was withheld. Drone footage was unavailable on technical grounds. The server holding operational records was denied for 2 years, then permanently deleted on the eve of the collection date. The investigation was closed with a finding of no sufficient evidence. The evidence had been deleted before the finding was made. The officer who created the classified compartment in April of 2011 became head of all UK Special Forces in Afghanistan the same month. He became Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, the second highest military position in the British Armed Forces. He was appointed First Sea Lord and Chief of the Naval Staff in May of 2025, days after a panorama investigation identified him by name. He serves as aide-de-camp to His Majesty the King. The general who was briefed on the suspicious killings in 2012 did not disclose those concerns to the Royal Military Police and allowed the same squadron to redeploy to Afghanistan for a second 6-month tour, subsequently became head of the British Army. Neither has been charged with any offense. Between 2022 and 2025, UK Special Forces conducted a review of resettlement applications from Afghan army personnel who had served alongside the SAS. 1,585 applications were rejected. A Special Forces officer appointed for the purpose sat alongside civil service caseworkers and instructed them to refuse applications on grounds that a subsequent government review found to be spurious. The Afghan commandos of CF 333, men who had served on the raids, who had witnessed what the inquiry is investigating, who had at one point refused to continue, and whose officer had drawn his pistol, could, if resident in the United Kingdom, be called as witnesses. The inquiry has no power to compel foreign nationals overseas. Some of those whose applications were rejected are dead. The former Veterans Minister described the process as a significant conflict of interest. Every individual mechanism in this sequence was, in isolation, defensible within some institutional logic. Classification of sensitive whistleblower testimony protects sources and operations. Delay in providing server access respects national security concerns of an active Special Forces organization. Closing an investigation that has not produced prosecutable evidence is the ordinary conclusion of investigations lacking sufficient proof. Rejecting resettlement applications from foreign nationals follows established criteria. Taken individually, each decision belongs to a recognizable category. What does not belong to any recognizable category is the pattern. The laptop wiped the day before access. The server withheld for 2 years and deleted on the eve of collection. The whistleblower testimony labeled anecdotal and locked away from the investigators who would have found it material. The investigation narrowed from 52 deaths to 1 case. The documents that did not exist until a court order found them. The witnesses who cannot testify because their applications were rejected. Each mechanism connects to the next. Each step was taken by people who knew what the previous step had been. Saifullah Gareb Yar was 16 years old on the 16th of February, 2011, when the sound of a helicopter woke his household before dawn. He was searched, bound, and placed with the women and children while the operation proceeded. He heard the gunfire from where he was held. He found his father shot dead inside the compound. His brothers were found in the fields outside. His cousin was found in the neighboring house. He spent the years that followed trying to establish what his country's government already knew. Under court order, that government produced the documents. The documents described what had happened to his family as the latest massacre, written by the soldiers who carried out the operation on the day it happened. The inquiry that will determine the full extent of what was known, and by whom, and when, is not yet finished. He is still looking for the rest. The independent inquiry relating to Afghanistan will report when it reports. What it will do with its findings, whether Britain will follow the path Australia took, whether any of the men connected to the events under examination will face a legal process commensurate with what the evidence appears to establish, the record cannot currently answer. The inquiry cannot order prosecutions. It can document, with statutory authority and the full force of judicial examination, what was known and what was done, and what was concealed and by whom. While it continues, the institution proceeds. The promotions stand. The titles are current. If you think the Afghan families who spent years navigating a legal system to find what their government already knew deserve to see that process completed in full, and that the record of it should not disappear the way the Sonata server did, share this. Because the inquiry cannot compel your attention. Nothing is stopping you from giving it. And if you want to understand how an institution this old, this decorated, this publicly trusted, produced what this inquiry is documenting, not as aberration, but as pattern. Not in one deployment, but across many. Subscribe. Because this is not the first time. The mechanism that produced the Sonata deletion did not begin in 2010. It begins considerably earlier. And the record, if you know where to look, has been making the same argument for a very long time. The data was deleted 1 to 2 days before the investigators arrived.